Welcome to this video on authentication factors. On the CISSP exam, you may see a question or two about the single factor and multi-factor authentication. So we are going to cover that in this video. Now we see the screen often, don't we? Username, password, login kind of things. Well, authentication is just the validation of a claimed identity. And that's really what we are doing when we log in, where we use our username, which is our identity, and then the password, which is our way of authenticating that identity. The way that we do that is through a multitude of different factors. So we have three in particular that we need to know for the exam. First, we have single factor authentication. This uses a single factor to authenticate a subject's identity. Then we have two-factor authentication or 2FA. This uses two different factors to authenticate a subject's identity. And then we have multi-factor authentication or MFA. This uses multiple factors to authenticate a subject's identity. The difference between two-factor and multi-factor really they are one and the same. Sometimes is just one more common to say two-factor because we are using two different factors versus just saying multi-factor, which could be as many as three different factors. In reality and in practice, normally we are doing two-factor authentication. However, there are situations where you will see multiple factors for the authentication. Also, within the factors are the different type of factors. So, there's type 1, something you know. This is knowledge base. Something you have memorized. Something you know in your mind, right? Then, there's type 2, which is something you have or ownership based. It's something that you have in your hand, something that you have on your mobile device, something you have on a desktop, something else other than something you know, right? That's type 2. Then there's type 3, which is something you are. This is also referred to as biometric base. And we have a whole video dedicated to biometric base. That's how complicated this can get. Now, single factor authentication is pretty simple. It's pretty cut and dry, right? You have your subject, you have an application of some kind that they want to log into. Well, that application is going to be connected to some kind of directory services, whether it be a LDAP server, an Active Directory server, could be a Radius, could be a TACAS, could be a lot of different things, right? Well, in essence, what you are going to do is you are going to log in with your username and then enter your password, right? That's something you know. You know that password or you know that passphrase, right? This is also called one-to-one authentication because it's one subject to one factor of authentication, right? And if you authenticate correctly, then you will be given access. And again, the username is how you verify your identity. The password is how you authenticate that identity. Now, on the other hand, with multi-factor authentication, this is also called one-to-many, one subject to many different type of authentication. So in this case, we go to log into that app and we enter our username and password, right? We use our single factor authentication. We identify ourselves here and we authenticate with the password, right? And that's against a directory service. Again, like an Active Directory, an LDAP, Radius, whatever it might be. And that's great. And once you authenticate this identity, now you are going to be prompt for something you have. Okay, you have authenticated this identity. Now, do you have the token, the smart card or an ID badge or something like that? that can prove this is in fact you, right? This is what called type 2 authentication. Something you have, right? Your token, a smart card, an ID badge or some kind, or you could just ask for something you are. Let's authenticate you using an iris scan, a retina scan, a fingerprint scan, a palm scan, and so on, right? This is by far and way proves without a doubt that this is indeed you trying to authenticate and gain access to the system. So again, the username and password is a single factor. After you have authenticated, you are going to probably be prompted for, say, a one-time password, and that one-time password will be presented on a token, right? And that one-time password is just, you have 30 seconds to enter this password or this password or whatever it is, okay? And that's what considered a form of two-factor authentication. If you require both of this, if you require type 2 and type 3, that's what we call multi-factor authentication. So again, they are interchangeable. It really doesn't matter. Now on the exam, they are going to be used interchangeably. You might see two-factor as an answer. You might see multi-factor as an answer. If given the option, choose the more specific answer. For example, if a question asks, if a user required to provide username and password and a soft token, what best describe this? The answer is two-factor authentication over multi-factor authentication. If two-factor is not an answer, then go with multi-factor. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Now, there's also context-based authentication as well. This has to do with something you do or behavior-based biometrics. Somewhere you are geographically based, and then also the device or the network that in use, right? So the context of where authentication replaces the need for password-based authentication. So something you do is often referred to as type 3 authentication as well. I have seen it called type 4 in certain references and resources, but in reality, it's still a type 3 authentication factor. But in the CBK and the NIST also call this type 3 as well. So that's what I would go with on the exam. Now, this type of authentication again is behavior-based biometrics. So we are talking speech, how you talk, movement patterns, like how you sign something. So signature dynamics, how you type something, keystroke dynamic, things like that are used as behavior biometrics. And then the device or the network can be based on MAC address. It could be based on IP address. It could be based on a lot of different things. And it can also be based on where you're geographically located. So the IP address that's on this device here could be registered as an IP address from a certain country or a certain location. And you can also filter down on the IP addresses that you know belong in a certain geographical area. And then if they don't meet that criteria, then they are not even presented with the opportunity to authenticate. Okay, so this is context-based authentication. There's also context-aware authentication, which can replace the need for password-based authentication as well. Okay, so the bottom line for this video is to clearly understand the different authentication factor and the common example of each of them within this video.